A game about connections. A game about death. A game about what it means to live. These are just a handful of the ideas being explored by Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding, his first non-Metal Gear game in, well, ever. Actually, that's not true, but we'll get to that in a bit. To understand Death Stranding, one needs to understand the path its creator took to making it. Kojima's entire existence revolves around these themes: living, dying, and forming connections. Here's everything you need to know about Death Stranding and the man behind the game, Hideo Kojima. Born on August 24th, 1963, Jesus Christ, this guy aged well. Hideo Kojima has always been a cinephile. Due to his father Kingo's profession as a pharmacist, the family was always moving to a new prefecture, with Hideo finding stability in stories. He, along with his two older brothers and parents, would sit down to watch a movie every night, and he was not allowed to go to bed before the film was finished. This would often include westerns and horror films, a lot of the content generally considered inappropriate for children to watch. Kingo Kojima also showed young Hideo war films, as the elder had always been fascinated by the military. His parents would give him money to go to the cinema on the weekends, on the condition that when he returned, they would all sit down to talk about the themes in whatever film he saw. It's no wonder then that Hideo's first creative ambition was to make movies, and with the use of his friend's 8mm film camera, would shoot zombie films in his spare time. This was actually literally my childhood. This infusion of creativity in his life meant that he was always making up stories, and would often be found laughing or crying to himself as he dreamt up these tales. He has struggled his entire life with either walking or driving into things because he's lost in his own imagination. Kojima was so supported in his creative endeavors by his parents that it was devastating to him when at the age of 13, his father passed away. He had lost his closest imaginative confidant and became incredibly isolated. It is an emotional weight he still feels to this day, finding himself having to surround himself with people or always have the TV on to deal with the loneliness. Nevertheless, it emboldened him to join the film industry. But as you can imagine, the number of outlets in Japan in the late 70s and early 80s to pursue such a career were few and far between. Compounded with the fact that Kojima's ideas were usually extravagant in scope, he simply did not have the resources to realize his passion and the projects he wanted to make. This caused him to become disenfranchised, combined with his concern for financial stability, a societal pressure that permeated Japanese culture at the time. His family had been well off, but his father's death dealt them a huge financial blow, and his relatives that had pursued careers in the arts had all struggled. This desire to help support his family meant Hideo did not move to Tokyo to study as previously intended. Instead, he stayed close to his mother and made the safe choice of economics at a local university. Kojima could never escape his creative ambitions, however, and wrote novels in his spare time. He imagined that he might be able to get something published, maybe win an award, and use the money and recognition to kickstart a film production. His plan started with attempting to get some of his stories published in local magazines, but he was never successful in this endeavor, grossly surpassing the desired page count. This was, of course, incredibly discouraging to Kojima, exacerbated by the fact that none of his fellow students were interested in cinema. The feelings of isolation and loneliness were getting worse. And then, Kojima discovered the Nintendo Famicom, known as the Nintendo Entertainment System here in the United States. He immediately saw the value in the medium, and envisioned a future in which video games became as important as films. The interactivity spoke to him, and over the course of his time at school, his interest shifted into making games. His peers and mentors attempted to dissuade him from going down that path, and instead stick with the more socially acceptable and stable career choices. But it was Hideo's mother that urged him to pursue his passion, telling him he could do whatever and should do whatever he wanted in life. He was inspired by his mother's belief in him, but equally as inspired by his friend's disbelief in him. The desire to succeed in the face of such negativity only fed the fires of creativity. Kojima started his career in the medium at the company that he would eventually develop Metal Gear with, Konami, developing games for MSX computers. Whilst he desired to work for Nintendo, Konami was the only game company in Japan to be on the stock market, and he hoped that that fact would ease the minds of those in his life that believed he was making the wrong moves. There, he found like-minded people, many of whom had all desired to pursue other creative endeavors, draw for comics, form a band, or even, like Hideo, make movies. And like Hideo, they saw video games as a new imaginative frontier to explore, ones they could become the pioneers of. This camaraderie greatly assisted with Hideo's loneliness. Despite finally finding somewhere to fit in, the early days at Konami proved challenging. Hideo was an incredibly inventive person, but soon found the limitations of games at the time inhibiting to his ability to tell stories. He likened it to the early days of cinema, when silent films had simple plots that mainly involved people getting into some kind of physical dilemma. Quickly, however, as games allowed for features such as saving your progress so you could pick up a story from where you left off, Hideo aggressively pushed to make games with more complex narratives. His lack of programming ability, however, was a hindrance, and he found his ideas constantly overlooked by the company. Hideo at many junctures considered leaving Konami, especially after his first project, Lost World, was cancelled after 6 months of development. However, Hideo was brought on to take over direction of a game the company was developing, codenamed Intruder. Konami wanted to make a war game, as they were becoming increasingly popular, and Hideo was tapped due to his love of war films. The game was initially designed around intense combat as you fought your way out of a military compound, but the hardware limitations of MSX computers impeded the team's ability to execute that design. Inspired by the film The Great Escape, Hideo changed the combat nature of the game to one of stealth. This was a hard sell for Konami, but Hideo eventually convinced his superiors that it was the right move. The game came out under its new name, Metal Gear. The game was an incredible success for Konami, with the company deciding to port the title to the Famicom. Kojima was uninvolved with this version of the game as he was not on the Famicom team, and was upset with the drastic changes made to allow it to run on the console. Irregardless, Metal Gear was an even bigger success on the Famicom due to its much larger market penetration than the MSX. Konami immediately greenlit a sequel for the platform, but without Hideo's involvement, again since he was not on the Famicom team. In fact, they didn't even tell him directly that they were developing the game, with the young director learning through colleagues that it was happening. The game, Snake's Revenge, was being developed exclusively for the Western market and the NES, never seeing a release on the Japanese Famicom. Hideo's co-workers urged him to create a true sequel to the original Metal Gear, which he did, called Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, which released exclusively on the MSX2 in Japan. Frustrated by his reliance on programmers to enact his vision for both Metal Gear games, Hideo developed his own engine, which he implemented in a Blade Runner-inspired game called Snatcher, and its spin-off, SD Snatcher. Development for the first title was troubled, the team once again being hindered by hardware limitations to enact Hideo's vision. They took a break from the project, which Hideo used to begin development on another title, Policenauts. The game took inspiration from many different topics: organ transplantation, hate crimes, space travel, featuring a cop that is one of 5 on humanity's first space station. Both Snatcher games and Policenauts, released on the MSX2, received commercial and critical acclaim. Hideo's continued success and the arrival of disc-based platforms such as the PlayStation gave the creator more control within Konami. He oversaw the development of ports for his games to other platforms and had total freedom to choose the developers he wanted to work with, one of which was Yoji Shinkawa. The pair then went on to develop their first 3D game, the third in the Metal Gear series. However, as the second game, Solid Snake, had only been released in Japan on the MSX2, Hideo decided to reboot the title of the series, and so was born Metal Gear Solid, in reference not only to the titular character Solid Snake, but in the team's dedication in switching from 2D to 3D graphics. The game was revolutionary at the time, featuring a soundtrack that dynamically adjusted to the player's actions, greater interactions with the world, and unique details that weren't repeated through the game. Metal Gear Solid launched Hideo into international stardom amongst the industry. Whilst this allowed him to feel validated in his career choice, it didn't mean to him as much as the validation from his mother, whom had been so supportive in the beginning, but after a decade of his childhood friends finding success in more reputable industries, had her rethinking everything. It wasn't until the release of Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, which Konami poured precisely 1 metric fuckton of money into, that his mother began telling her friends what he did for a living again, due to his recognition in Newsweek as one of the top 10 people to watch in 2003. Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, in the most Kojima move imaginable, was originally entitled Metal Gear Solid 3, representing the 3 tallest skyscrapers in New York. The game was developed for the PlayStation 2 and featured a controversial switch to a new character, Raiden. Solid Snake was only playable in the prologue of the game, and the inclusion of Raiden was a secret up until the title's release. Promotional material deceived players, featuring gameplay and cutscenes with Solid Snake that in the final product actually featured the cyborg ninja. Changing protagonists was a decision Kojima came upon after desiring to have the story told from a different perspective than Snake's, as well as an attempt to appeal to female gamers. Along with the ambitious and complex script, Raiden proved a controversial decision amongst players. Nevertheless, the game was a massive hit, and along with its predecessor, enjoys its place on many best games of all time lists. The next game, the first under Kojima's own subsidiary of Konami, Kojima Productions, was Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. It was initially designed as a PlayStation 3 title, but the console took too long to release. Development proved challenging as the team found it difficult to realize a realistic jungle setting on the current hardware, having to reduce the frame rate of the game from 60 frames per second like its predecessor to 30. On top of the locale, Hideo also wished to have the game be vastly different story-wise, opting to create a prequel game that told the origin of Naked Snake and his transformation into Big Boss, the soldier Solid Snake is a clone of. Snake Eater was the intended end to the Metal Gear Solid series, but fan demand for a sequel to Sons of Liberty brought about development of Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots. Kojima initially stepped aside from the project, leaving it in the hands of MGS3 co-writer and director of Zone of the Enders, Shuyu Murata. Tragically, overwhelming negative fan reaction, including death threats, guilted Hideo into stepping in as co-director. Hideo was tangentially involved in the 3DS remake of Snake Eater, and Platinum Games' Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance, an action-focused title featuring Raiden. He expressed interest as early as 2012 in making a game in the Silent Hill series, implementing his new Fox engine. However, the first Metal Gear Solid Fox engine title would be Metal Gear Solid Ground Zeroes. The title was meant to be released in tandem with the next numbered game in the series, but the scope of the game was dramatically reduced and morphed into a prologue for Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain. This game's ties to Hideo and MGS were initially disguised, simply dubbed The Phantom Pain, and supposedly produced by a new Swedish developer, Moby Dick Studios, led by a man named Joakim Mogren. Several clues, including the fact Joakim is an anagram of Kojima, led to fan speculation that this was the true 5th Metal Gear Solid title. This move was made because Kojima wanted to gauge fan reaction to the game without it having the weight of the Metal Gear Solid name attached to it. The game continued Big Boss's story from Peace Walker, with the destruction of his military compound Mother Base acting as the inciting incident. A year before the release of The Phantom Pain, a demo called PT for a new horror game dropped on the PlayStation Network from 7780's studio. It was revealed upon the completion of playing the demo that this was actually created by Kojima Productions and was a tease for Silent Hills, under development by Hideo Kojima and acclaimed director Guillermo del Toro, starring actor Norman Reedus. The project would tragically never see the light of day, as Kojima parted ways with Konami soon after the release of The Phantom Pain. Exactly why the two split is still a mystery. but it was seemingly a very messy divorce. Was it because Hideo refused to work on further Metal Gear Solid titles after 5? Was it because his celebrity outgrew Konami, a company that was beginning to shy away from game development to focus on other sectors of its business? Hopefully, one day we will learn the answers to these questions, and I will definitely make sure to do a video on that if we ever do. It was heavily rumored that Hideo would take a long break from game development, but mere months after news of his split from Konami, he announced he was reforming Kojima Productions as an independent studio and will be partnering with Sony on his next title, which was revealed as Death Stranding at the following year's E3. Hideo brought back Norman Reedus as the main character Sam, with Guillermo del Toro making an appearance as the character Deadman. The game, dubbed by Kojima the first in a new genre known as Social Strand, will see players attempting to reconnect the United Cities of America after a devastating event brings about the destruction of the United States. This event revolves around creatures known as BTs, monsters from the other side, that now plague the country. Sam must utilize a bridge baby in order to detect the BTs on his quest to rebuild America. Hideo Kojima's story is one of loss and loneliness, an attempt to never give up trying to connect with people through his creativity, no matter the hurdles in his way. Death Stranding could be seen as an adaptation of that life story, embellished and extravagant in the way that Hideo imagines the world. It is comforting to know that one of the world's most revered creatives has not only struggled with issues that plague so many of us, but has utilized them as tools for his ambitions. It is a welcome lesson to learn, and one that will hopefully become more clear after the release of Death Stranding.